Right, welcome everyone to today's discussion. We've got Sam Sweeney, who is the founder of the Mesopotamia Relief Foundation, which came into being 2 years ago to help Assyrian Christians in the Kabul Valley in northeast Syria rebuild their infrastructure and rebuild their life following attacks by Islamic State terrorists and other problems such as natural disasters that have afflicted them. So to talk about that and his extensive experience in the Middle East more broadly, Sam Sweeney, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Eduardo. I appreciate it.
Why don't we start off? Well, tell us a little bit about Mesopotamia Relief Foundation. What does it do, and why did it come into being?
Sure. Yeah. So the foundation kind of came as a natural outlet of my work as a writer in the region, the Middle East, and I had been traveling to northeast Syria, working sort of on a book project, but writing articles and all that. And I was able to go to the Assyrian villages of the Kabul Valley. This was back in 2019. Made a couple trips and basically realized that there was, something that needed to be done. And we'll talk a bit more about, what the situation was there. But it's sort of there had, basically been this series of disasters that had befallen these villages, which have a very interesting and unique history within the history of Syrian Christianity. And despite the fact that there's been a lot of money and support to Middle Eastern Christians over the last decade or so, there's, this area had sort of flown under the radar screen. And so this came really out of realizing I was maybe placed somehow to be able to try and do something that has been done to varying degrees of success, but certainly with some success elsewhere, particularly in Iraq, which is to help Christian or other minority areas recover after ISIS, but that it hadn't been done in this particular area for this sort of complicated set of logistical and political and other reasons. And so that's really where the foundation came to be, was this kind of series of coinciding factors that all led to me realizing if I didn't do it, nobody was going to do it because it wasn't being done.
And I think I've heard you mention before that actually, as far as aid to Christians in the Middle East goes, places like Iraq have fared decently well in international attention. But what are the reasons for a place like the Kabul Valley in northeast Syria not getting as much attention?
Yeah, so you have the area of the northeast Syria falls outside of the control of the Syrian government. So it's controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are backed by the U.S. They're often called the Kurds in the media, but it's there's not just Kurds within this, and then there's also a lot of Kurds don't support this. So it's not, but in media parlance, we can say it's controlled by the Kurds. Northeast Syria is, and so that has meant that getting in and out is sort of difficult. It's sort of this unrecognized entity, and the only way in for kind of foreigners, and even for a lot of Syrians who are wanted by the Syrian government, is through one sort of unofficial border crossing with the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And it's the logistics of it are quite tricky, and therefore a lot of the money that's gone in to help Christians rebuild within Iraq just doesn't really make it over the border to Syria, other than into areas that are controlled by the Syrian government, such as Damascus or Aleppo. And then the other sort of thing, there is money, there's aid that has come to this, to northeast Syria, particularly from the US government and other Western governments that have backed the Syrian Democratic Forces that control the area. But because of just this massive need in other areas, these small Christian villages where a lot of most people left became sort of a low on the priority list. When you have, for example, an hour drive away from these villages, you have a camp of 60 to 70,000 people that were the kind of women and children that were captured along with ISIS. So basically the ISIS wives and their children, and nobody really knows what to do with them. And so they're sort of in this essentially a prison. that's treated as a camp, but that's 60 or 70,000 people that these Western governments are more or less responsible for, though they don't claim responsibility for them. But just to take an example of where, so it's not a surprise that these villages where there's less than 1,000 people remaining, that they just kind of fly under the radar.
And this, this area of northeast Syria, which is, controlled by the Kurds, and like you said in the media parlance, what that wasn't always the situation, right? How did that develop? That was in the war, I gather.
Correct. Yeah. So before 2011, this was all just part of Syria. It was another province. We're talking mostly the Hasakeh province, and the area that we're working at is in the Hasakeh province. And you have the provinces of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, which half of Deir ez-Zor and most of Raqqa is controlled by the Kurds, by the SDF. And so before 2011, these were just Syrian provinces. There had been some issues. 2004, there was sort of an incident in the city of Qamishli, which is a mostly Kurdish, but also Arab and Christian city in the northeast in 2004, right after the US invasion of Iraq. A football, soccer game turned into sort of a political clash, which culminated in some of the Kurds carrying photos of George W. Bush and calling on him to go to Damascus and finish what he started in Baghdad. And it was more complicated than just that, but there was basically some tension that had been there. But I was in Syria in 2010 studying Arabic, and at the time, there was no, it was safe to go there. It was sort of off the radar screen. I only passed through there on a trip to Turkey, but it wasn't sort of a no-go zone of any kind. It was a part of Syria and all that. And then when the war started, there were protests in the Northeast like everywhere else, but the PYD, which became the SDF, is the political party that sort of makes up the bulk of the SDF, they sort of reached an agreement with the Syrian government in 2012, and the Syrian government sort of withdrew from most, but not all, of the Northeast, and eventually sort of just controlled these small pockets within the cities of Qamishli and Hasakeh, which are the two major cities in this area. And so so from 2012, you've had this sort of kind of autonomous entity, which they eventually named the Autonomous Administration. And so that was limited to the very far northeast corner of the country. And then when ISIS came through, starting in 2013, but 2014, 15, they took over vast amounts of area in this land, or in this area. The U.S. government eventually backed what became the SDF, to take these areas back from ISIS. So their territory vastly expanded to basically everything northeast of the Euphrates River. So they call this region the Jazira, which in Arabic means island, but it literally, because it's between the Tigris and the Euphrates, so not a literal island, but a figurative island. And so then, since then, from 2015, 16, 17, when the SDF took over these areas, their territory expanded. But then it was with the Turkish invasion in 2019 that took away some of these areas from them, which are now under control of Turkey. At the same time, the SDF then had to reach an agreement with Russia, which allowed the Russians to come in and sort of fill the gap that the Americans left by withdrawing. But then the Americans unwithdrew. They reversed that decision. And then the Syrian government also came in along the border in certain areas. It became what had been a very clean map, which was the Euphrates River. And on one side, you had the US and the SDF. On the other side, you had the Syrian government. And the Russians became this very complicated, overlapping, kind of interweaving segment of political control and military control, which is still now the case. It's to today, and it's very complicated. It's more complicated than really anybody understands fully.
So it's in this kind of messy context now that really you're trying to do this work of helping to rebuild some infrastructure and such for these Christian villages. Tell us about that Christian population there. How did they come to be there, and what was it that prompted the need for aid more recently?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, this community has a very specific and unique history within Syrian Christianity. So it's kind of a minority within a minority. And the Assyrians that now inhabit the villages of the Kabul River They're originally almost entirely from the region of Hakkari, which is the far southeast corner of Turkey. And so before World War I, they lived there, and alongside a Kurdish population that sort of that was interspersed within them. And then what you had in the during World War I, you had what we usually call the Armenian genocide, but which really targeted all of the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire, particularly what is now kind of central and eastern Turkey. And so this population sort of specifically, they fled to Urmia, which is now in Iran, which was then controlled by the Russians, which this is pre-Russian Revolution by about a year. And so they were there with sort of the assumption that Russia was going to come in and take over these eastern parts of Turkey, and that they would sort of go home when that happened. And then the Russian Revolution happened, and so Russia actually withdrew from that area. And so they fled, then fleeing sort of the Ottomans, they fled to what is now kind of eastern Iraq, eventually ended up in sort of northern Iraq. And then there was tensions with the Iraqi government, and which culminated in a massacre in the town of Samail, which is next to the city of Duhok, which is in Iraqi Kurdistan. And so from there, this is in 1933 now. So they've been in Iraq, they stayed for over a decade. And then in 1933, this massacre in Samail occurred. And so the population, a large chunk of it, crossed the Tigris over into what was then Syria, what had just become Syria, basically, but was still controlled by the French, right? Of course, Iraq was controlled by the British at this point. So and the French actually gave them this area and gave them the land along the Kabul River, just northwest of the city of Hasake, which was also had just been established basically by the French. So they were settled on this river, and they arrived. They didn't speak Arabic. They had just been put in what is now an Arabic majority Arabic speaking country. They didn't speak Arabic. They spoke, Assyrian, what they call Assyrian, what scholars would call Neo-Aramaic, but which is essentially an Eastern dialect of Aramaic. And then they mostly all knew Kurdish as well, because they had lived alongside the Kurds, and probably some knew Turkish, but because they were living under the Ottomans. They sort of show up as quite foreigners in this country and get settled along this river, and they with these farming communities, and really lived in quite peace, in the same way that everybody in Syria lived in this sort of dictatorship, this event, once we get up to the Assad regime, in this sort of dictatorship that kept all these tensions from boiling over. But in the context of these villages, kind of preserve this piece of history, which is this very specific dialect of Aramaic that they speak, and this interesting tradition belonging to the Church of the East, which of course is the church of the Persian Empire historically. When we had the Romans and Persians, the Church of the East is really the descendant of the Church of the Persian Empire. So you had all these kind of interesting and very unique things that were preserved in these villages, which was the case really until 2015. So 2011 happened, of course, then the uprising happened in Syria, and you have a big, in the villages, I would say, a great sort of nostalgia for the days of the regime, right, when the Syrian government controlled this. And I think it ignores the fact that there were a lot of things they didn't like at the time, namely that Arab nationalism, which is the official ideology of the Syrian government, essentially didn't acknowledge their existence. It said, no, Syria is an Arab country, we speak Arabic. They weren't, their sort of Assyrian identity was oppressed and subsumed within the Syrian state. But now, in retrospect, everybody goes, well, we wish, we didn't know what we had, basically, and we wish that none of this had ever happened. So from 2011 on, those first couple of years, like I said, so the Syrian government withdrew about 2012 and sort of turned the area over to the Kurds, specifically to the YPG or PYD. There's lots of acronyms. Kurdish politics, more than anything, has a lot of acronyms. But what's now the SDF, so the Syrian Democratic. But really what had happened is the Syrian government had sort of withdrew into itself. So they were on paper, they were there, but there was no uh, real presence of the government. So it became just a chaos, kidnappings, and targeting Christians, and not just, but certainly not just Christians. It became this sort of lawless area. That's really about 2013, and then 2014, ISIS really, their presence was expanding in this area. And it was early 2015 that ISIS then came in and took over these villages, and almost, they kidnapped about 230 people. Most people fled to the city of Hasake. And it was there, that's really this kind of defining moment in the history of these villages, which is where almost everybody left. And after, so ISIS only controlled for about 3 months. But when they came back, a handful of people came back. Most people tried to, and eventually did get to Western countries, particularly Australia, Germany, and the US, I would say, are the most common ones you hear of. Everybody has relatives there. Most people went to Lebanon first, or to Erbil, to Iraqi Kurdistan. And from there, they, got a visa to wherever, to Australia or US, and went. And then you have this now, so it was a population of probably about 15,000 before the war. And of course, from 2011 on, some people had already been leaving. It's not that they all stayed until 2015, but it was a trickle. And then the floodgates opened after ISIS took over. And now you're down to fewer than 1,000 people between all of these villages, which are about 33 villages. Of course, some of the villages have, more people stayed, and some are basically, you're down to one Assyrian guy left. And then the last thing on that, kind of about the situation, is that in 2019, of course, Turkey invaded northeast Syria, and they came up to the very last, or first, depending on how you look at it, the Assyrian village. So the front line now between the Turkish-backed militias, which are all quite jihadist, and the Turkish military, and between them and the SDF is the last Assyrian village. So those, the far villages that are furthest northwest on the river, are basically uninhabitable. There's daily shelling, and it's quite a bad situation. The villages, once you get further away from that, it's about a 40-kilometer, 30-mile stretch. The further away from the front line you get, the more normal life has sort of gone back to. But then what you had is a bunch of, mostly Kurds and Arabs, IDPs, displaced people came and have sort of settled in the villages. So now what you often have is like one or two Assyrian families and a bunch of, Arab or Kurdish families, which has created a tension within the villages, but more than anything, a sense amongst the Assyrians that these are no longer their villages, that they've sort of lost their Assyrian identity, even though the land still belongs to the Assyrians and all that. So this is kind of even after all of these different events, that's kind of the issue that really nobody knows how that's going to play out, and it's a source of fear, I think, for the Assyrians, that is what eventually ends their presence in these villages.
You mentioned the 2003 incident in which people were walking around with, signs for George Bush to come in and finish the job, so to speak, which is really interesting to hear, because normally in the US what you get is opinions just that, the American government is bad for, obvious reasons. But walk us through a little bit. There must be just sort of this vast swath of opinion and argument that we in the US just never hear about. So take us through some kind of just the real discussions and opinions that we don't get a window into day to day from the media.
Yeah, sure. So that was, and that was, of course, Kurds calling on the U.S. government, not necessarily anybody else in northeast Syria, which would also have a lot of, the Arabs and Christians were not calling on George Bush to come in. So the Kurds, at the time, so the Kurdish opinion is also quite divided. So you have you could broadly call them leftist, is the YPG, who the U.S. has backed on the Syrian side of this conflict. And within Syria, their sort of main opponents, they call it the Kurdish National Council, which is kind of the right wing, more meaning in a sense, just more religiously conservative faction, which backed the opposition sort of naturally. And and that faction is sort of close to the Iraqi Kurdish governing party, the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, which is who runs, the show in Erbil, in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is where I'm at right now. And so that
And just to place that in
particular,
context, that's just across the border, right, from
correct.
northeast Syria.
Correct. Yeah. So, and as I said, it's the only way into northeast Syria at this point, unless you have a visa from the Syrian government, in which case there is a functioning airport actually in Kamishli still, which is also a Russian base now at this point. So so that within the Kurdish community, that's kind of the main divide. Is this we call it like the PYD is the political party acronym, and the KDP or the KNC, so the kind of left wing versus right wing Kurds, and of course the PYD, which became the SDF, are tied to the PKK, at least ideologically. So, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Turkey has had this, now 40-year battle against, and of course that is why Turkey invaded in 2019, was that the PYD or the SDF had established this what they see as like a Kurdish kind of statelet on their border, and they fear that this then kind of encourages the same idea across the border in Turkey. And so but then you do have a faction within Kurdish public opinion, which is opposed to the PYD, and which backs the Barzanis, the family that rules here in Erbil, which is the traditionally just like more religiously conservative and more tribal faction. But then, of course, those are gross oversimplifications at times, but that's kind of the general breakdown. But then what's I think, and so you have then similar breakdowns. So if the Christian community has a faction that has backed the Kurdish movement, SDF, okay, and they particularly latched on. So the idea is that the Kurds are demanding rights as Kurds, as non-Arabs within Syria, and so the Syriac and the Syrian movements within those say, yeah, well, that's what we want to, so let's work together to create this sort of pluralistic entity that then allows us a space to be sort of non-Arabs within the Syrian Arab Republic, which is the name of the country. So that is certainly a minority opinion within the Christian community. The Christian community is largely backed the Assad government, and they were sort of complicated why, but I think it's important to always remember when we talk about Christians and the Assad government, is you have kind of two overarching things. One is security. So the Christians, in the Northeast often mostly came from the genocide in Turkey. And so and of course the genocide in Turkey, the Ottomans, it came right after this sort of opening up of the Ottoman Empire towards this liberal reformist movement. So they sort of heard this rhetoric of human rights and equality and citizenship and all this. And this was, the Ottoman Constitution in 1876 was sort of this big step away from this kind of Islamic caliphate to a sort of national empire that everybody could be a part of. And that culminated in the Armenian genocide. So they didn't put so when the Syrian revolution started, for example, there's a lot of people that are very skeptical of these slogans because they've sort of heard this before. Human rights, democracy, etc. And so there was the security and fear of Islam, really, and fear of their neighbors has always led them to back the government and they would all feel very vindicated. People that took that position feel very vindicated by how things played out over the last 10 years. They say, see, this is why we needed a dictator, because when it became chaotic, we suffered more than everybody else. But you also have, there was, I think, very few Christians would believe that a democratic election would ever lead to a Christian leader in Syria, right? So political power was never a hope. And this is, I think, also gets misunderstood, particularly there's a lot of critics of the Christian community in the West for backing Assad, because we see Assad as this brutal dictator, and he is, and he killed his own people using every kind of method imaginable. And so people say, well, hi, that's very unchristian to support somebody like that, and it's, and without, I'm not certainly not defending the position that the Christians took, nor criticizing it. Just, I think what gets missed in the analysis of that is that that you really have this. There was no sense that democracy would improve their lot. At best, it would be a wash, if not make it worse. right? And so that's kind of the general Christian opinion. And like I said, you had this faction that have backed the Kurds, and who have popular support. It's not that they're a total fringe element, but certainly the minority. And then, you have then amongst the Arabs in the Northeast, you have this both that back the opposition and more these jihadist elements, but also that remain very close to the government. The Arabs in the Northeast, a lot of them, it's still very tribal, and a lot of this was like the regime was very used to playing tribal politics, and they were very smart at keeping certain tribes, particularly the Tay tribe, which is one of the historic tribes in the area, on their side, and um, you know, Arab politics, Middle Eastern politics generally, I think we often overemphasize ideology, and we miss just how much it's power struggles within these competing groups. And so, for example, it's not that it's not that there's a faction of the Arabs that necessarily like the Ba'athist ideology, the sort of secular, semi-pseudo-secular, ideology of the Ba'ath Party, et cetera, et cetera. It's that they've historically been backed by the government, partly because they're Arabs and they're surrounded by these non-Arabs that the Syrian government was always suspicious of. But that it's, that's way more important than any sort of ideology. And this also, you see this in the opposition as well, where it kind of is just this, it's a power struggle more than an ideological one. Not that ideology doesn't play any role. But then the one last thing on the kind of public opinion that you asked about, that I think that really the aspect that gets missed by the media the most is this fairly substantial portion of the population who I would say are kind of like cautiously pro-regime. They're not fervent believers, because you have those. You have in all of these communities, you have people who just bought into it, drank the Kool-Aid, and they truly, they love Assad, especially like of the Christians and the Arabs. You have people who really truly, love him as like a father figure. But you have a lot more people who just sort of cautiously kind of kept their distance from all of these movements, but never lifted a finger against the government. And those people were really, I think, more decisive in the government surviving than has been picked up on. And I think that's maybe a missing element in some of the analysis, which is, and I'd say the sentiment tends to be expressed in a way that's kind of, they don't really love Assad, but they just don't have any hope that anything else would be any better. It's sort of this, well, this is what Syrian politics are, so let's not shuffle the deck because we were living okay prior to that. And I think that, and I think what might surprise a lot of people is you have this a lot amongst all communities, including the Kurdish community. And I hear a lot of Kurds in the Northeast who want the government to come back, even though that doesn't line up with necessarily what you hear in the media.
And crossing the border for a minute into Erbil, where you said you are, take us through some of the opinions there. I imagine it's close by, but it's a very different context, just given being in a different state. What are some of the mix of opinions there, especially regarding U.S. intervention in the Iraq War and things like that?
Yeah, so Erbil, of course, being the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which was set up by the U.S. essentially after 2003, but or was recognized then. It was set up in 1991 after Saddam, after the no-fly zone was instituted here in the north, so after the Gulf War, at the no-fly zone in the north of Iraq and in the south of Iraq, which allowed basically the Kurds here to prevent Saddam from coming in. Had he been able to use his air force, they would have not been able to withstand him coming in. So you had this kind of decade of the 90s and up till 2003, where it was essentially the same situation you have now in Syria, which is this unrecognized yet de facto autonomous area. And then in 2003, when the U.S. overthrew Saddam and then set up a new constitution, it allowed for the creation of federal regions, and there was a referendum, and that led to the creation of this autonomous region. So here, so there's a lot of parallels to Syria, but the biggest difference is when we talk about Kurdish politics in Syria, and then how the Christian politics relate to that, is that in northern Iraq, the Kurds are much more a solid majority of the population. So in northeastern Syria, you have a real mix of the population. There's areas where the Kurds are the majority, but you have a lot of Arabs there, partly for historical, longer standing reasons, and partly because the Syrian government moved Arab tribes along the border starting in the 60s to create the situation that there is now. And particularly and very specifically to separate Kurds along the border from Kurds in Turkey. And this was actually, a lot of them were the tribes that when they built the dam in Raqqa on the Euphrates, it buried these villages underwater, and then they moved the people that were buried. So they're literally called the submerged, the maghmurun, is what they're known as in the Northeast. It means the people whose villages were submerged under what's now Lake Assad, I guess they call it. I think they changed the name now with the Kurds did, but then they moved up to the border. So whereas in Iraqi Kurdistan, it is I don't know the percentage, but it's heavily Kurdish, and the minorities here are very small minorities, which means that the Kurdish government here doesn't have to cater so much to opinion that is not kind of non-Kurdish opinion, right? So the Kurds in northeast Syria right now, they really have to kind of walk on eggshells around the Arabs, because at any moment the Arabs could sort of turn on them and it upends the whole political movement that they set up. Whereas here, that's not so much the case. So you have the same kind of left-right divide, they call it. These are imprecise terms, but that's sort of how. So you have how people talk about it, but the KDP, then the Kurdistan Democratic Party, who controls the two provinces of Erbil and Duhok. And then you have the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, controls the other province of Kurdistan, which is Suleimani. And the PUK is sort of the more left-wing one, and the KDP are sort of more right. Both have good relationships with the US, both have reasonable relationships with Baghdad, but based on a mutual suspicion, which, from the Kurdish side is that all the historic grievances against the Arabs, particularly under Saddam, and from the Baghdad side is that they feel the Kurds are not holding up their agreements regarding the oil here in particular, that a lot of the oil is in the Kurdistan region, and the constitution it's meant to be shared, with provinces. And they claim accurately that the Kurds are illegally selling a lot of the oil that they extract and not kind of keeping the books on it and giving Baghdad their fair share. And so that is, so you always have these issues that sort of unites Kurds against Baghdad, for example, some of these issues but then when you go under the surface, it's these divisions within Kurdish society become very clear. So the Christian politics here then are very different, in that you have elements of the Christian community are very sympathetic to the Kurdish cause here, say more so than you get in Syria, because they sort of felt targeted also by Saddam and by the government. And then you also have a very anti sort of Kurdistan faction within the Christians that's more prominent in the diaspora, but it certainly exists here, and it taps into grievances that exist here on the ground. And a lot of it's in the identity. You have a lot of Assyrians who reject the notion of Kurdistan. They say, well, this is Assyria, this is ancient Assyria, it's not Kurdistan, and this sort of thing, which that's more something that plays out on Twitter more than in real life. But it kind of taps into some sort of grievances about how they've sort of found themselves marginalized. And then so within the Christian community, you have sort of these very intense debates, but they're often sort of a lot of coded language, hard to follow, but that essentially break down to kind of people who are comfortable with the Kurdistan government and sort of happy operating within that. And then you have a faction that sees them as just as bad as all of the other actors that are around. And so that's more or less lines up with in Syria. You have kind of that same divide, but the demographics and the politics are just different enough to it doesn't always match up one-to-one of which factions will sort of work with the Kurds and which ones won't, and et cetera, et cetera.
I think back, and you've probably seen it as well, the clip where Ted Cruz, Republican presidential candidate, went to, I think, In Defense of Christians or some organization like that, to give a talk, and in the midst of it gets booed off the stage by these Middle Eastern Christians who are there in the audience. I think because he said, Israel is our great ally, and I think that the Christians in the audience start booing him. And he walks off stage. So there's an obvious disconnect there, right? Ted Cruz, this Christian politician and so forth, and yet the opinion of Middle Eastern Christians is clearly not lined up there. So if there's a takeaway that maybe Americans or people from elsewhere as Christians want to take, because I think the instincts are good to want to help Middle Eastern Christians and what's obviously been a struggle, how do people tangle out all these opinions, not step on landmines, and what's the actual maybe right approach to take that lines up with what the true interests are, if it's even possible in such a varied mix of situations and settings.
Yeah, no, and that's a great example of this, as you say, this kind of disconnect between, I think, what's often good intentions on the part of Americans, particularly American Christians that sympathize with Christians in the Middle East and want to help, and sort of end up not realizing some of these, as you say, these kind of landmines. I think, you have, because the Middle Eastern Christian community is very diverse within itself. And so even as I mentioned before, like this Northeast Syria, where you have these Syriac and Assyrian and Armenian Christians who came from the genocide, it's very different. Their historical sort of experience is very different from Christians in Damascus and Aleppo and Latakia and Homs, the cities of Western Syria, who almost all identify ethnically as Arab. They all speak Arabic. They're mostly Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic, some Maronites thrown in for some diversity. It's a very they're sort of very different. So if you went to any of those different communities, you're always going to find these big divides in how they understand the region, and yet it's easy to sort of paint them all with one brush, and that they're all sort of persecuted, they're all have gone through these terrible things over the last however many years. But they I think that's the first one is sort of understanding that what like a Chaldean Catholic in Erbil, how they see, let's say, Israel or something, is probably going to be very different from like a Greek Orthodox in Damascus. They might both be opposed to Israel or sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but they'll understand it very differently, particularly because you have a lot of Christians who identify as Arab ethnically. I mean, it's more that sort of their cause, and they see it as their cause. Whereas once you get out of those sorts of politics, you get, I wouldn't say it's certainly not a more pro-Israel stance, just a more neutral stance. It's a cause that's sort of far away from them. And they don't feel it because they don't identify as Arab necessarily, and so they don't see feel any closer to Palestinians than they would to any other suffering people, for example. And so, and yet, and so this is one of those two where I think Assad and how Christians have perceived him and how Westerners perceive Christians and their relationship to Assad, it shows this. You do have an element, of course, of, and you'll hear this a lot. I hear this from Christians in the Middle East, and not just from Christians, Kurds, Arabs. Particularly, I would say, though, Kurds and Christians, you'll get a faction, a minority, but who really admire Israel, for example. But they would never say this publicly, right? They'll tell you this sort of in private conversation. But politically, they just can't say that out loud, right? And yet that is not the reason that those Christians booed Ted Cruz, right? It's not because they were worried about being seen, and it was a genuine sentiment. They did not like what he said, and they don't like Israel, and they sympathize with the Palestinian cause, right? There might be some tiny faction within that that boo because they feel they have to boo, right? And that is certainly exists. And I think what happens, and sometimes too, is you might find somebody who tells you that, and then you kind of think that everybody then is booing just because they feel they have to boo. This happened a lot again, with Assad and the Christians, where somebody like, well, we felt like we have to back him, and so that's why we back him. And somebody said, okay, well, they're all doing it because they're afraid, and it misses this actual genuine sentiment. So then when you get to the more practical level, I think that you were kind of getting at with your question, which is like, so when you step in then to these communities and you say, I want to help, and where are these interests gonna align or divide? And there's no right or wrong answer, because again, it really depends on where you're at. But I think the main thing is you don't want the Christians to ever be a pawn in some other cause that you have. You could be pro-Israel and you can support Middle Eastern Christians, but you shouldn't condition your support for Middle Eastern Christians on them agreeing with you about Israel. Like, there's certain things where you might just have to say, okay, I think we can agree to disagree, right, on this geopolitical issue that we're not talking about, and yet we can still work together on something else. And this is I would sort of direct that at, let's say, American politicians who are going to particularly take, both of which are going to be causes that might be dear to a lot of people, supporting Israel and supporting Middle Eastern Christians. And it's, and that kind of goes then the other way too, which is like, don't make, for example, Palestinian Christians a pawn in sort of an anti-Israel agenda that you might have, or a pro-Palestinian agenda, if that's not what they want to, if that's not the direction that they want to go in, and you get, that, happens just as much, where you kind of want to justify a particular action based on, what your assumptions of what people's views should be. And I think that's where you really fall on these landmines, as opposed to coming into somewhere and just saying, well, we're going to disagree on this, but we can agree on these other things. So, no reason that somebody receiving aid from a Western organization in northern Iraq, in a Christian village that was taken over by ISIS, there's no need for their views to line up with you on Israel, and you're not doing any harm to Israel by helping that community, even if their views don't line up with yours, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I want to touch on a little bit, you mentioned, for example, Arab nationalism and the kind of move to assimilate perhaps some of these minority populations into a wider Arab population, and some Christians are just, Arab Christians and not necessarily Assyrian or so forth. But I have two questions about that. The first is, here in the U.S., I mean, we're just kind of a vacuum of assimilation. I mean, whatever identity you bring does not last very many generations, but it does seem that in the Middle East, these identities can last centuries. You still have sort of Armenian, you still have Assyrian populations in the midst of what has been an un-Islamic and largely Arab place for a long time. So why has that been the case historically, that identities have been much more sort of fixed and protected, perhaps, compared to a place like the U.S., where it seems like assimilation happens in the blink of an eye?
So I think the main, the Middle East is such a tribal society, both in the literal sense and the figurative sense. So obviously, literal sense, even actually these Assyrians, it was a tribal society in Hakkari, in Turkey, where they were living. And when they came to Syria, there was still these tribal identifications that lasted really up until today. But it's, as with a lot of things in the last 10 years in the Middle East, it's sort of been weakened quite strongly by the fact that the tribe didn't really play any significant role in this very traumatic experience. So people start to look elsewhere for sort of sources of identification. But but even then, so that's what we're talking about in the literal sense, tribal, but then it's also just a tribal society in the sense you're always a member of a group before you are an individual. And this is something that is sort of accepted here, and it's not seen as a bad thing. Whereas in the US, I think, we have this drive to be, just to step outside of our unique, ethnic identity or something and be part of this larger entity. And I mean, I think Europe would probably be somewhere in the middle. It's you have obviously now, so for Middle Eastern Christians, for example, especially Assyrians or Syriacs who speak these, dialects of Aramaic that they're very proud of. The fear, one of the fears is, like, as they move to Australia or the US and Germany, even oftentimes they're going to the same place. For example, in the US, they all go to Chicago. Almost everybody went to Chicago, and they live, I think, in specific suburbs of Chicago, They, in a sense, like people that were hanging out drinking coffee in the village in Syria are still today hanging out and drinking coffee in Chicago together. But there is a different, there's this sense that, yeah, once we go there, and within a generation or two, they don't speak the language anymore. They've assimilated. They might still identify as Assyrian. They might not, but at the very least, there's sort of this, very weakened ties that very quickly, as you say, just sort of melt away into the melting pot. And so I think, for example, at Erbil, where I'm at now, you have 4 languages sort of spoken kind of regularly by natives of the city, which are Kurdish, Turkish, Arabic, and Neo-Aramaic. And so those are all spoken by the different respective elements, that speak that. And you'll go from, like here, in the Christian part of town, where most people speak Neo-Aramaic. A lot of them, they don't speak Kurdish very well, right? But Kurdish is definitely the main language of the city. And so you end up with these very kind of, divided societies where people only mix really with the people who also, who are like them, because you couldn't maintain this if it wasn't a very fragmented society, right? If everybody was sort of hanging out with each other, going to the same schools, going to the same religious, ceremonies, et cetera. Eventually, this just would melt away, but it doesn't, because they don't hang out with each other so much. They interact in this very sort of cautious way. And of course, that varies city to city, time, era to era, person to person. Of course, people have friends across these lines and stuff, but and colleagues, and often, and intermarriage, and et cetera. But it does. There's definitely a sort of sense of maintaining, you hang out with people like you, and in a place like Erbil, I think it becomes really obvious because you have this linguistic divide. It is literally, okay, you go to this part of the city, they speak a certain language. You go to a different part of the city, they speak a different language. You see it really obviously. I think it's reflective of something that exists in our society as well. We just don't see it so starkly because we're all speaking the same language eventually, and that sort of thing. So I think that is, and you just always had a sense of the Middle East that like the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, each community was allowed to govern their own affairs. There's this sort of live and let live between groups, not necessarily between individuals, and that's something that, we don't have so much in the West, but particularly in the US, which I think means that these identities, as people emigrate, that's why they disappear more.
And you had mentioned that, especially as a Twitter phenomenon, that you get some of these ventures into questions of what Assyrian identity is. Can you take us a little into that world, and then maybe, to wrap up, just obviously Aramaic was the language of Jesus, and Neo-Aramaic is not the same dialect, but in a sense it is the closest we've got to a living, continuous language and tradition. So could you just talk a little bit about, maybe the importance that people feel about preserving that as a spoken and organic language?
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the other thing that's very confusing about studying Middle Eastern Christianity, particularly in Iraq and northern Syria, is you get all these different names. You have Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac. And the confusing part, we don't have time to get into all the details, unfortunately. But because it's a, hours long sort of, and but the confusing part is people use these terms differently. And the sort of simplified version is that some people use them as an ethnic term, some people use them as a sectarian term, and most people use them as both and understand them as both. So most people who say I'm Assyrian, that understand that to mean they're a member of the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East, and they ethnically identify as an Assyrian. You have a smaller faction who are, let's say, I'm a Chaldean Catholic, but I ethnically consider myself Assyrian, right? And that exists. So there's plenty of people like that, but it is, I would say, the minority. But but these issues of identity then with the language, in a way that's sort of an overlap of the two. Like the church has placed a very great emphasis on preserving these dialects, as have the sort of nationalist factions, which see the churches as the cause of the divisions that have happened between these Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, etc. Right, but nonetheless, they sort of all agree that the language is a point of pride. The church obviously puts a huge emphasis on the fact that it is, they're speaking dialects of Aramaic, and that is the language of Jesus. And I would say popular opinion also puts a heavy emphasis on that. You hear this in Ainkawa, the Assyrian or Christian suburb of Erbil, where most of the community in that city lives. People will say this. Oh yeah, we speak the language of Jesus. That's definitely an important marker of identity. But you do have this sort of nationalist faction who don't like that comparison because they see it as sort of reductive, of this like long tradition that they have into just because Jesus spoke it isn't the defining factor of this language that they take pride in the same way that an Armenian would take pride in their Armenian language, even though Jesus didn't speak Armenian, and yet as an Armenian Christian, they sort of have that identity. Their identity as a Christian and as an Armenian are inherently tied, and they don't see them as contradictory. But part of the issue is that the Assyrians never got a country. So these divisions have inevitably people in the political sphere, whether it's in Turkey or Syria or especially in Iraq, they had to make compromises, and everybody made different compromises. So some people went sort of closer to Baghdad, some people towards the Kurds, et cetera, and it meant then that it really divided people in a way that around these identity issues, because there isn't this sort of country they're all trying to protect together. They're all trying to survive as minorities, and they've made different choices about how to do that. And I think that really underlies some of these intense debates. And then, of course, people move to the West, and they get sort of really tied to this on Twitter, for example. And not that it's just on Twitter. Obviously, it's a real thing as well for them. But it is it gets very heated in a way that here, most people would see. I'll take an example: a Chaldean guy in Ainkawa that I know. And I was kind of trying to suss out his views on this just to sort of see, and I was sort of new, figuring out these different divisions, and he was like, well, in Baghdad, Islam rules. He's like, here, Islam rules, but it's moderate Islam, so this is better. And him, like, that's how he sees it, because he's living here under, so he likes the Kurdistan government better because he just sees them as more moderate religiously than anything that's going to come out of Baghdad. He didn't talk about Assyrian identity and how the Kurds have, if they've tried to erase it or not, or et cetera, et cetera. He's not seeing it out, but a lot of people, and it's not just in the diaspora. You have it here on the ground, but more so in the diaspora, they sort of get, you have a lot of people who don't have to deal, or, a better example would just be like in Kurdistan, services work better than they do in Baghdad, right? So the areas under control of the Kurdistan government just are better governed than areas under control of Baghdad. And that's something that's very real to a lot of people, that they are willing to make sacrifices to their identity to have functioning water and electricity and et cetera, right? And even if they're sort of aware of the fact that they're making that sacrifice, they will make a choice that becomes easy, I would say, to criticize from the outside, because you're not faced with this choice of not having electricity in the summer and it being really hot, or not having water to irrigate your field, or et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that it's, but and the difference is stark enough where you hear this opinion. There's a town called Al-Qosh, which was under the control of the Baghdad government, now under control of the Kurds. And it's a very contentious issue. And I'm not, I haven't done a comprehensive survey of public opinion of people in Al-Qosh. I've just talked to some people when I'm there, and people about it, and both sides have plenty of legitimate, views of why Baghdad or Kurdistan should rule it. But what's easy to lose if you're not there is the fact that it is just better governed at the moment. Like one guy, when I was there last time, he's just like, well, the Kurds, they don't try to stop us from like drinking, having parties. so life's better under them. Like that's the limit of kind of his analysis of why he would rather be ruled by Kurdistan. It has nothing to do with Kurdish identity. Should there be an entity called Kurdistan? Should this be called Assyria instead? It's just like, well, no, we want to have, beer at our weddings. So the Kurds let us do that, and we fear that the Shiite militias ruling Baghdad will eventually try to to stamp that out. So yeah, so we'd rather have the Kurds, and that's something you're not going to get in the diaspora.
Some would argue, of course, that key for a Christian identity is that ability to keep drinking. So
Exactly.
so I just want to wrap up then with something I remember being very, very struck by, which when I lived in Chicago and I went to a restaurant that was owned by I assume Assyrian Christians, the murals on the wall were scenes of ancient Nineveh, and the Lamassu statues and all these art and architecture from ancient Mesopotamia. So could you talk a little bit how that, I assume there's a nationalist angle as you're describing of wanting to evoke this ancient past over and against just Christianity as your identity, but how does that imagination, I suppose, play in, and where's that coming from?
Right. I think you have, obviously, so you have this kind of very secular element in the Assyrian community that would see that as their primary identity, right? They see these ancient pagan traditions as being what it means to be Assyrian. In my experience, as a very small minority within the actual community, and it's, again, particularly prominent in the diaspora. Here, you see all those same symbols. They very much exist, but I would compare it really to how an Italian might see Roman heritage, or a Greek would see Greek heritage, like pagan Greek heritage. It's Christianity, you could say, has sort of replaced that on a the moral system and in many ways the symbolic system. But yeah, there's still this pride of like, oh yeah, but back in the day we were that other thing. And they did, they built the civilization, and we can sort of take pride in that without being of the same religion as them, and I think that is how most Assyrians that I talk to here and in Syria, like in the Kabul villages especially, I've had this conversation with them. They're very proud of their Assyrian past, and it just so happens that sort of a lot of the kind of glory days of that past really were in the pagan era, and so that, as symbolically, just as you say, these Lamassu statues and these sorts of things that they take pride in, they're not Christian symbols, but it doesn't necessarily, I don't think they would see that in any way as being contradictory to their Christian identity or heritage.
Excellent. Well, Sam, I know you've got to jump to a class after this, so I want to be respectful of your time, but thanks so much for joining. This has been a really, really informative and interesting talk.
No, thank you for having me. Thanks for the excellent questions.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.